Okay, I'm going to go into some more detail about digital stuff. Specifically tied to my research I've done in the past years in Second Life, but also just sort of reading a bunch of that literature. Before I get into that, though, I wanted to mention a couple of things that showed up when I was going over the last set of critical thinking papers. Hang on a second. Oh, yeah. What I wanted to actually mention was, and again, I apologize. In trying to cut the semester short, I suddenly realized I dropped a whole chunk of the religion material out. And a couple of folks are actually looking at this whole issue of art. At least one person was looking at it in some detail. Sorry. And art is an interesting area when you look at symbolism and art. In fact, the whole issue of symbolism and the idea of symbols. And again, remember, I went over this at the beginning of the semester. Remember, a symbol is something that's been given meaning. So a symbol has to have several factors. One, it has to be collective. Well, in anthropological terms, a symbol has to be collective. I suppose in psychological terms, anything could be symbolic to an individual if it's given meaning. But to an anthropologist, it has to be a collective thing. Here's a real good example. Okay. This is a little piece of jade, and this is symbolic. These were used from basically the early Zhou dynasty, which would be about 4,000 years ago, right through the Tang dynasty, so till about 1,000 years ago. So for about 2,000 years. These were carried. They were usually cut into two parts, and so they would have to be fitted together. They were like a puzzle. If you had this complete thing in Chinese society, you basically carried this around. You had to be a member of the imperial court. This gave you the right to execute anyone below the emperor. So as a sign that basically you were essentially the emperor in absentia by virtue of carrying this thing. And so, obviously seeing anyone lugging all these little suckers around, everyone just was in a panic because you could basically execute 99.999% of the people in Chinese society. No juries, no trials, no nothing. Just, you've got this. So you were the emperor's surrogate, I guess, for lack of a better term. And that's what this thing represented. Now, it's actually a tiger. And so from an art standpoint, it's a, pretty nicely done carving of a leaping tiger. And I assume probably the original version, I've seen older ones, was actually intended to be leaping on an animal. So just like, you're attacking something for the emperor, I guess, would be sort of the symbolism. So these were entirely symbolic. They were never intended to be art per se. They were intended to be highly visible and really, really, really obvious. They'd be slightly larger. This is obviously a replica. So they'd be, maybe about this large. But there would only be one of them. Now, what you would also do is if you had this in two parts where they would be fitted together, you would give this to two individuals and they'd have two parts of an assignment. Maybe someone was supposed to go and report on something. The other person was supposed to be the enforcer. When they meet up, they fit these two together. And at that point, they now have, again, the power of the emperor basically in absentia. So these were never intended to be art. They were artistic in the sense that you had people who were very good at carving jade, carve these, pretty realistic looking jade animal. But they were entirely symbolic. But there is some symbolism of political and, I suppose, judicial power. Now, by about 1,000 years ago, these quit being used. They went to other symbols, usually made of large square pieces of jade. So they quit using these things. So carrying this thing around after about 1,000 AD, no one would have, it wouldn't have meant anything. No one would have, panicked if they saw one. What you find about 600 years ago is these things start to get made in copies. And what you do is you give them to people who are taking examinations at universities, or then it would be the civil service exams back in that time in Chinese history, for the purpose of being successful in the exams, with the intent, based on the historical analogy of the tiger, with the intent that you would end up in the bureaucracy and you'd be close to the emperor and be that powerful. So even though the symbol is no longer politically functional, it's no longer a statement of judicial power. It now becomes something that you make by the thousands, I assume over time is probably by the millions, and you give cheap versions, which is one of these, to someone who's getting ready to take the civil service examinations to join the government, with the idea that it becomes a good luck charm. And what you find is by, you know, maybe 300 years ago, as people would wear these things, if they'd passed the examinations and they'd been given one before that, they'd wear them as sort of like a good luck charm on a bag that would usually carry their money and stuff. So what happened is, even though the symbol didn't change, the symbol, I mean, this, even though this is, you know, was only carved, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, it's actually a very accurate representation of something you would have seen 3,000 or 4,000 years ago when it was actually in original use. So the actual piece of art in the sense of the carving never changed. What it meant, the meaning changed completely. And yet, to a certain extent, the current meaning today is based on an interpretation of the original meaning back in the day, if you want to think of it that way. So this is a really good example of the idea of symbols in art. Is this artistic? Yeah, I suppose. But you have to remember, to an anthropologist, art is always basically in the eye of the beholder. Something can be artistic, whereas someone else can see it as not being particularly artistic. This is a real comment that you see frequently in what you might call contemporary art. And to an anthropologist, we're not really all that interested in whether something's art or not, especially because frequently to anthropologists, what becomes art is when it's taken out of its cultural context. So whereas that would have no meaning outside of Chinese society. Let me grab this. Office is full of props in case you've never seen it. This is a katsina. This is a Hopi katsina. They're dolls. They're carved out of cottonwood originally, and then covered in fur and other things like this. This is a spirit hunter katsina. Now, originally these were substantially smaller, and they were used for ritual ceremonies, especially in holgans or basically in kivas. So what you find is about, and most people would have never seen these. Most of these were actually hidden. There was a ritual with some of the Hopi that they would actually make these things. People would see these in dreams and then make one for themselves, you know, based on their relationship with the thing. So this was actually seen as a manifestation of something from beyond the screen. If we want to go back to our stuff earlier on magic and religion. So if you would, this would either be an ancestor or some sort of relative of yours who didn't have a physical presence, but obviously was willing to interact with you because you'd seen them in a dream. So you're making a physical version, so when you want to talk to them, it's sort of like having their phone number. You can talk to them more easily. Oops, I don't know where to put it where you guys can see it. So that's a katsina. Now, about 300 years ago, Europeans move into this part of the American Southwest. They see these things, they become interested in them, and they start collecting them for places like museums. Now, to the Hopi, these aren't art. To the Hopi, these are just ritual images that you use when you're doing particular ceremonies. So they're tied to magic and religion. If you want to, if you remember that video, they're somewhat similar to the way those horse effigies were being used by the guys that were going into trance. The horse wasn't seen as a art object to them. It's seen as a symbolic thing that they're using. These are used in very much the same way. You traditionally would go into trance while you're looking at this, and in that process, then you would connect with it when you're in trance. So katsinas were very, you know, they were a technical device used for certain ritual ceremonies and certain purposes, especially trance. Europeans see these things and they decide that they're art. Now, because of the European view of what art was, they weren't considered the equivalent to a Monet or a Rembrandt or something like that. They were called, quote, primitive art, unquote. They were also seen interesting because they had this religious or magical connotation. Now, it gets very bizarre about katsinas, and this is a good example in this particular one. This, again, I think is about 30 years old or something like that. Can't remember. I think I got this one of my uncles. But the interesting thing is what happens is, as Hopi initially get very upset with people taking these things, especially because when they become part of the U.S., you know, Anglos could just go into a Hopi kiva and just basically take these if they wanted them. There's nothing the Hopi could do about it. They were wards of the U.S. government. As an Indian, you didn't have any rights. And in fact, till the 1960s, you basically didn't have any rights. So in that situation, a lot of these are lost. You now find them in museums where they now become, you know, centerpieces of you know, primitive art collections. And also, of course, held by wealthy, you know, individuals. And so they're entirely seen as art. In fact, if this was an original one from, say, the 1700s, it'd probably be worth about, I don't know, I'm guessing maybe $6,000 to $15,000. So they're now worth quite a bit. There's people who do nothing but collect katsinas. Having said that, what happens is that Hopi very quickly realized that they have no problem with carving what they call dolls. And this cutscene is actually a doll in the sense that the Hopi that made this wasn't going to use it for ritual purposes. He made it to sell it. So at that point, this becomes purely art. To Hopi, this isn't symbolic. This is not a symbolic representation of a spirit ancestor or something they've talked to in their dreams. It's just something that they make because this particular form of a guy shooting an arrow with this particular outfit is real attractive to tourists. Now, of course, what's really bizarre about this one is it's got bought by a Cheyenne tourist, who's obviously another Native American, who then, it gets very complicated. But basically, so Hopi are making these things, not en masse. They're not making like 5,000 of them a day. But people do nothing but make these things to make a living. So at that point, they're producing art. Now, I can guarantee that those folks also have dreams and make smaller ones that are the original ones that they're still using in their own private ceremonies. They're actual ritual objects, and they don't see those as art. So this gets into a very complicated relationship with symbolism and to a certain extent religion, but also in art. Art is invariably symbolic in the sense that it has meaning, otherwise it wouldn't be of interest. It would just be an object. A lot of symbols are not art. And a lot of things that are religious can be both symbolic and art. But notice that in this particular case of the Katsina, it's not, in this particular form, it's not symbolically irrelevant. In a smaller original form, it would be symbolic and ritually important. It'd be part of a religious system, but it wouldn't be art. This one's art, but it's not religion. Now, if I've totally confused everyone, that's totally cool, because that's, when anthropologists start talking about art, that's how it usually ends up as the ball of confusion. So when you're looking at things that are considered art from an anthropological standpoint, the first thing you want to ask is, who's calling it art? And why are they calling it art? Is it tied to concepts of, for example, aesthetics? Is it tied to the concepts of, say, the mysterious, which I would argue that for a lot of the Hopi Katsinas probably has more to do with the fact that they're very surrealistic looking by Western standards. Feel free to Google Katsina if you want to see what they look like. And they're very, very different. They're obviously alien to the Western sort of, aesthetic tradition. And I think, and yet they're interesting. So I think to Westerners, they become art for that reason. They're sort of mysterious. But they're not symbolically relevant because, to be honest, I used to remember the name of this, but I don't remember it now. I have to look it up. I've got it somewhere. But not being a Hopi, I don't remember what it's supposed to be a representation of if it was in its original form. So I don't have any symbolic integration into the original form of the figure. To me, it's just a representation of a family gift, as it were. So when you're looking at art, art is a really fascinating area that anthropologists get involved in. But at the same time, we tend to take a little bit of sort of distance from it, especially when you get into art and the idea of you buy someone's art from another society or another group, and you're making a representation of it. Let me pause here and fish something up to give you an example. No, that didn't work. I couldn't find it. I was thinking of the guy that does the oftentimes black and white images of hula dancers, the contemporary artist, I can't remember his name, the photographer. Those would be really interesting examples of things that would be art, but they're taken out of the sort of the symbolic context of hula at all. They're just, attractive black and white art prints, very popular with tourists. So this issue of art, again, anthropologists have been heavily involved in it. Anthropology is probably more interested in when traditional forms of symbolic meaning become art, and both how that's consumed by folks outside of that group, and also how then the folks in the group relate to it. So there's been a fair amount of interesting work done, for example, on the Hopi view of what you'd call tourist katsinas versus traditional katsinas, in the sense of what you might call functional to the Hopi katsinas. So it's a whole area of sort of interesting context for that. Okay, so back to the digital, which I was originally going to talk about. When you're looking at this issue of digital group membership, digital identity, I think that the work that was done starting in especially 07, 08 on Second Life is really valuable for a bunch of reasons. One is just totally fortuitous, and that is the fact that there was an anthropologist who was studying internet development companies in Palo Alto in 2003, 2004, I think. And so he became sort of an intern watching the development of a company. And it so happened the company he was studying was Linden Labs, the folks that make Second Life. So it's really sort of interesting because we actually have an anthropologist who was actually observing them in the process of building that platform, that virtual world platform. And he was actually there not so much when they were starting it, but when they actually brought it out and were trying to figure out how people were relating to it. And one of the fascinating sort of folklore stories about Second Life is that the company originally planned Second Life, what you guys have seen, as a platform in which people would design games. So they built this platform, the idea that people would log into it and build games that you then put on like phones and stuff like that. And so when they initially opened it up, so they put it what we call a beta test out, and they brought in a bunch of folks who had some clue and basically said, okay, here, go play with this thing. And they of course you don't want to bias the sample, so they didn't tell them what it was they were supposed to do. And they were totally shocked because literally within a couple of minutes, people started building houses to live in, people started interacting with each other. And initially they thought, oh man, this is totally screwed. We're gonna have to go and start the whole thing all over again because it didn't work. They're not building games. And all of a sudden they had one of those sort of light bulb moments and they realized, wait, they're actually using this in an entirely different way than we ever intended. They're using this not as what was called, in fact, the term for this is called sandbox, which they still use, Linden Labs still uses in Second Life, which is for people to make things. And that's actually, of course, what the original goal was, to make things, but they thought it was going to be games. And what they realized is people were making things for themselves. They were making houses, they were making trees, they were making landscape, they were making clothes. And they were smart enough to realize that, hell, if the customers want to actually make the world so that we don't have to, then why don't we just back out of the way and let them at it? So what's real interesting is Second Life was actually developed by the users. The company just was smart enough to just back off and basically, make money out of the monetary system, but not get involved in building stuff. And even in Second Life today, they do the water, they do land forms, and they do roads. And everything else is by the users. So everything you saw, for example, in that Pleasantville episode or the Berlin episode, that's all built by the people that use Second Life, not by the company that owns Second Life. That makes it very different than like World of Warcraft or your platforms. Minecraft's probably the closest thing I can think of that's sort of like Second Life, but even then, a lot of it's actually built by the company. So the key thing about this is, one, it was built by the users. Then so happened a couple years after that, Bullersdorf actually went into Second Life because he was interested in how people were socially interacting. And this is where Second Life becomes really intrigued, because you guys see the later aspect of that in that Pleasantville episode. And this sort of has two things that are really key that have now parlayed, because you have to remember Second Life predates social media. Second Life was really big starting in 06, 07, 08. Facebook didn't start for another 2 years after that. So social media in the way that we think of course, Facebook is seen as like the grandfather of everything more recent. TikTok's only been around for, 3.5 years. So all the platforms that people use now that we think of as forever, post-date Second Life by a number of years. And they're all more structured. Second Life was pretty much from the get-go, and still is pretty much entirely unstructured by developers in the sense of the company. The only structure that's in Second Life is from the folks that actually use Second Life, the user base, or what they call residents. And the key thing that's real interesting about this, that Bullinger first noted, which wasn't why he was originally looking at them, was the fact that, on one hand, people moved in and out of Second Life very regularly. They still do. I think I haven't been in Second Life for maybe 6 months or a year. And even then I just go back because I'm just doing field studies on objects. So on one hand, I've been a resident probably for 8 years, off and on. But I don't think I've interacted with more than maybe 40 or 50 people. And that's only when I'm doing interviews about why did you build this house type stuff. So I don't do any of the stuff that you saw, for example, at Pleasantville. On the other hand, what he found is, even though individuals moved in and out very quickly by the time he was in it, remember this is 07, 08, so this is just after it had started. It just started to get really big at that time. What he realized already then was that even though individuals left, communities had already formed. The communities were already pretty structured. And many of these communities already had a very strong sense of normative attitudes and values that made them very, very distinctive. Now, there's the thing about Second Life is unlike the real world. In Second Life, there's no overarching authority. You can harass people, you can give them a hard time, you can do all sorts of stuff that actually is just actually blatantly obscene in Second Life. And the company doesn't care. As long as it's not, I think child pornography is illegal in Second Life because of the European Union. But almost anything else goes in Second Life. And so there's no control on social behavior done by the company that runs the platform. The only controls on social behavior had to be instigated by groups of people that got tired of people either harassing them or giving them a hard time or whatever. So basically users had to build a set of rules for group behavior. In doing so over time, these things have become very rigid and very structured. If you go into almost any of the areas that have, pretty strong communities, and I'm sure Pleasantville is one. I don't know that I've ever actually gone to Pleasantville to come to think of it. But if it's typical of a lot of Second Life stuff, when you actually go there, you don't actually go to the town. You actually go to a spot outside. You don't have it, I would guess, probably a lot of these do, a long system of rules. And you have to follow all these rules all the time. And they've actually got a system which keeps track. You break any of the rules and it throws you out of Second Life. You can't go back in. So they've actually got monitors, I guess for lack of a better term, on behavior and controls on behavior. And if you go in and you try to cause trouble, again, you get bounced out. And some of these, for example, more aggressive ones, I think this is true of the vampire, one of the, a couple of the vampire communities. I saw an article a couple of years ago. They actually had patrolling guards, I guess for lack of a better term. People would actually take time during the day and they would actually monitor a behavior of people who were starting to cause trouble in Second Life with that particular group of, say, vampires or whatever. And they would actually then hunt them down and harass them all the way through Second Life till in some cases they actually quit the program forever. So a lot of these groups take policing very, very seriously, but it's entirely done by the users. And as and Linden Labs doesn't care. As long as they get their little cut of the economic transactions, you can pretty much do whatever you want to. I think the standard rule in Second Life is if you really complain about someone, in maybe 9 months or a year, someone at Linden Labs will do something about it. But even then, they'll just delete that account. And all that person has to do is log back in, make a new account, and they're back in Second Life. So there's very little control, unlike a lot of the gaming worlds, where there's a huge amount of control over your behavior in terms of what you do or don't do. You break the rules, man, you're out of there, and they'll just, they'll delete every way for you to get in. I know Warcraft's famous for that. So what you find is that in Second Life, social behaviors were being built by groups. What struck Bohlersdorf, though I don't think it's in his book, it's in his later articles, is that, in the space of less than, in many cases, maybe a year and a half, what you actually had were very strong communities where individuals might leave, but a persistent set of values and attitudes and beliefs, symbolic artifacts, and all sorts of things that would make up a group and actually become normative to that population. So they lived in a particular digital place. They dressed or acted in particular digital ways. And yet what was fascinating about this, these folks are not from one place. Second Life is not an American phenomenon. Only about 20% of the population in Second Life is from the United States. There's big chunks from Europe. There's big chunks from parts of Asia. There's big chunks, for example, right now from South America, especially Brazil. So in Second Life, the people that you're interacting with, and I would assume that means a fair amount of the folks in Pleasantville, if you think of that episode, are not from the United States. And one of the interesting things that he found is that you do not have people then necessarily with a shared cultural background who go into a digital world and build a set of shared experiences, beliefs, and et cetera, that would be sort of a definition in some ways of culture in a digital environment that's basically, ephemeral. It's digital. It's not, you can't touch it like this cutscene. It's just, it's only a computer screen. One of the really key things about Second Life is sort of two things. One is he mentioned this, and I found it when I did a few of my interviews, but also a bunch of the work. There's a really fascinating journal on virtual worlds research that has that comes out at quarterly, that has a tremendous amount of actual real formal academic research on virtual worlds, and a lot of it's in Second Life, not surprisingly, since that's the persistent grandfather of them all. And one of the things that you see persistently in interviews and stuff like that is that users in Second Life invariably point out that a week in Second Life feels like a couple of months in the real world. A social relationship of getting to know someone, becoming a good friend in Second Life takes maybe a month, but in the real world that would take 6 months to a year. Falling out of friendship, again, takes very short periods of time. One of the persistent things that you hear across Second Life, and Bullerstorff noted this even in the earlier period, is that social relationships and emotional relationships become accelerated. They become compressed in time. And initially, when this was noted, everyone assumed that it was specific to Second Life because this was already highly visible, both with users and people talking to users by 09, 2010, etc. The other thing is how quickly groups developed. And by this we mean groups that have a very strong set of, again, normative values and attitudes, etc. Very, in some cases, really rigid rules of behavior. And yet you have the individuals transiting out. The fact that you could end up with groups that are basically out of a global world civilized, population, sharing and collectively agreeing upon all these things in such short periods of time was totally not what anthropologists assumed. We've always assumed that it takes a really long time for people to develop a culture, if not generations and certainly lifetimes. And here was Second Life basically, in some cases, especially, I think they're called furries. Furries and the vampires, especially, in other words, some of the more exotic groups in Second Life, actually have members. There's one group of vampires, I think they actually did some sort of a thing a little while ago in Second Life. They've actually, most of the users have been around now for 10 years. It's very, very rigid. In fact, they only let people in. People are invited into the group. They're not allowed, into the group. Very strict set of rules and behaviors. And so what you get is these very quickly coalescing clusters of people that then build basically, if you would, almost surrogate cultures in very, very short fashion, in very short order, but they're very durable. And what's really been interesting in Second Life now, and if I had the time I'd go look at it, is the number of people that have left Second Life at some point in the last 10 years that have now come back. This is one of the great sort of, urban folk stories in Second Life, which I suspect is probably true, because you see it in interviews. Oh, I was in Second Life till 2011, I left, and then I came back in 2017, 2018, and now I spend more time than ever. So these communities are not only durable, but the sort of eerie part of it is you actually have individuals that leave and then come back into the group. All this seems to take a tremendously short period of time. It assumes and seems to manifest that people actually organize in very short periods of time and yet can actually share attitudes and values very, very quickly and then follow them. And none of this is what anthropologists and sociologists thought happened. We thought this, this was a slow developmental process. Now, of course, as I mentioned, when Second Life came out, the assumption was this was unique to what we call virtual world platforms like Second Life. One of the things I have not seen, it's been discussed in some of the journal articles, and you see in some of the blogs that guys like Bullerstorff and such who are still interested in virtual worlds, is that they point out that when you look at social media, in the sense of Facebook, Instagram, et cetera, you find that people's emotional relationships accelerate equally quickly as they do in Second Life. They become equally intense as they do in Second Life. And they tend, in many cases, collapse as quickly as they do in Second Life. Think of the catfishing. Think of the catfishing episode and the number of people involved in very short periods of time in very intense emotional relationships that are entirely digital. And again, there's nothing unique about that. But the interesting thing is that, again, goes to show that one of the potential possible changes that we're just starting to realize, because you have to remember social media has been around for such an incredibly short period of time. If you're, a typical Chaminade student, it's been around since you were in grade. It didn't exist when you guys were in grade school. In grade school, you guys are using email. So it's only been around the time that you morphed through middle and high school and became adults. And so in that period of time, it's been very little chance for us to actually study it because it's changing so quickly. And because in many cases it's sort of distorted, because what happens is platforms show up and platforms collapse in popularity. So it's been very hard to figure out what's persistent to social media as a pattern and what's sort of platform specific. And then, of course, much of this also has to do with that many of these platforms don't share information. Facebook used to. In fact, they still do, depend on what your research relationship is with them. But a lot of these other platforms, like TikTok, for example, you can't get anything on them. So you don't even know how many users they have. You don't know what they do. You don't know what people spend time on. They consider all that stuff proprietary. Second Life actually was really good about pretty much having an open access. They still pretty much do. If you're a researcher in Second Life, they'll pretty much give you any information you want that they've got, and they've got a lot. So one of the key aspects that we're starting to realize, or we think is true, is that digital reality accelerates social relationships. So it's sort of like fast forwarding a YouTube video. You know, you're not speeding it all the way through, but you're speeding it up by a factor of 1 or 2 or maybe 3. And so what would take, you know, a couple of years or 5 years in a regular social relationship in what you might call the real world, in social media, i.e. the digital world, that same relationship might go through its entire process in maybe 3 to 6 months. Now, the reason we suspect this is the case, or at least in the work that I've done, is that we see the content of social media is exactly the same as real interactions. You get dissed on social media, you take it just as badly as someone disses you to your face. If someone compliments you on social media, it's the same. People don't see any distinction between digital communication and face-to-face communication, and they react to it cognitively and emotionally exactly the same. So, you know, you can tell people, well, you know, if you've got 5,000 people on your Instagram account and a bunch of them dump on your parade, what difference does it make because you don't know they actually are? Well, that might be totally true. It's maybe entirely factual, but it makes absolutely no difference in your emotional your emotional reaction to that happening. And what happens is things go up. So basically everything's sped up. And there's a bunch of evidence to support that, not the least of which is the amount of stress that social media generates in folks like you. And that's not unique to you as an individual. It's persistent in social media. And we'll stop right here because then I want to go over some of the sort of key aspects that we see of changes. Now, a lot of this is actually based on the research that I've done over the last, I guess, 10 years or something like that. Yeah, no, we'll just leave it at that. I think I have another PowerPoint that I might want to actually give you if you want to look at it, that actually has some of this data, but I'm going to stay away from that for now because I can get everyone confused. So I'll just sort of stop with this for now, something to think about.